But I brought a few examples along here. This is a drawer of beetles, and we have in the systematic collection here about 22,000 drawers like this, which makes it one of the largest, one of the most important collections of its kind anywhere in the world. And we have scientists from all over the world coming to visit the collection, because beetles are fundamental in ecosystems all over the world. Does anybody want to guess how many different kinds of beetle have actually been given a Latin name by scientists? How many different kinds of beetle we've actually discovered so far? Yes? 600,000. That's not a bad guess. The actual number is 400,000. So we might get another 200,000. You never know. Because 400,000 different kinds of beetle. That is things as different as you are from a chimpanzee is from a gorilla is from an orangutan. And we're talking about different species that don't recognize each other. There's a drawer here. This is a collection that was made in Tanzania in Africa, comparatively recently. And these beetles were collected in about 4 or 5 days in a good bit of tropical forest up in the mountains, in the Adzungwa Mountains. So if you go out into a bit of tropical forest, you can find hundreds of different kinds of beetle. If you go out into the garden, like the garden here at the Natural History Museum, or even your garden at home, the garden at the museum here, there are about 700 different kinds of beetle living there. So wherever you go in the world, there are beetles.
There's quite a lot of them. And you said there's about 400,000 identified species of beetle.
Yes.
To give that a bit of context, across the planet we've identified about 2 million species of everything. So 400,000 of that 2 million is beetles. So that's a really big percentage of the things that have been identified. Now you mentioned before we have about 22,000 drawers of beetles, was it?
Yes, that's right.
Do we have a rough idea of maybe how many individual beetles we have in our entire museum collection?
Well, we've got, yes, about 260,000 species and between 8 and 10 million specimens.
8 and 10 million.
Now, I've really always wanted to get somebody to count them, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4. But I've not yet found anybody who's... We've got quite a lot of patience, you know, entomologists are quite patient people. But I've never got anybody to sit down and count the beetles.
No one's quite that patient.
No, it would be good though, wouldn't it?
But again, you said between about 8 and 10 million. We have 80 million specimens here in our collection. So that again is a massive percentage of our collection is actually beetles. So we've got lots of different beetles here, but these aren't all recent collections. We've been collecting beetles here at the museum for quite a long time.
Oh yes, the collections go back longer than this museum. I mean, the Natural History Museum that you see, this was opened. It was founded by Sir Richard Owen, whose statue is in the hall, and it was opened to the public in 1881. But the collections go back much further than that, because before we were the Natural History Museum, we were a department of the British Museum in Bloomsbury. And it was at that time, in the 1800s, that they started bringing in things from all over the world. And one of the earliest collections that we've got was made on Captain Cook's voyages of discovery. And if any of you had anything to do with Australia, you'll know about Captain Cook. He's got bits of Australia named after him and appears on lots of stamps and money and things like that. But when Cook went to Australia in the 1760s, he brought with him a naturalist, Joseph Banks. And Banks was the first European naturalist to see things like a kangaroo and a eucalyptus tree. And he was bringing all this stuff back to Europe and saying, look, there's a kangaroo, it's like a deer, but it can jump. And it's got this pouch at the front, and all of the scientists in Europe were amazed and never seen things like this before. The duck-billed platypus, famously, everybody thought was a fake. And they thought that they just stuck a duck's beak onto some kind of beaver or rat or something. But the insects that Banks brought back are still preserved at the museum, and they're still in exactly the same state that Banks collected them. And what's interesting is a lot of those species are not here anymore. You'll get some big flightless insect that occurs, you know, in Sydney, and the city has now appeared and grown over, and that insect may no longer exist. So the only reason we know that some of these kinds of insects ever existed is because people like Joseph Banks picked them up and collected them.
So that can be why it's so important for us to sort of keep all these collections from hundreds of years ago, because they're still relevant today.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, this collection that you can come and have a look at afterwards was made by Charles Darwin on the voyages of the Beagle. And until recently, of course, Charles Darwin appeared on the £10 note, and he also has his statue in the main hall. And he was a very young man when he got this chance to go on the Beagle voyage. He was a university student, and he got put forward to be a companion to the captain on the Beagle, and he went out there and he collected 8,000 beetles, because beetles was what he liked the best. And when he got to the islands of the Atlantic, like the Canary Islands and Madeira, he started noticing that the beetles were very similar to what he knew back home, but just a little bit different. And he started wondering about why they were different. And the rest is history, really. It was because of the study of beetles that Darwin started to have these ideas that became so famous.
Fantastic. So we've been talking about all these beetles here, but I think maybe quite an important question we should ask. Max, what makes a beetle a beetle? How is it different to other insects?
Well, yes, a beetle is an insect, which means that it has 6 legs and the body is divided into 3 parts. So if you think of a spider has got 8 legs and the body is divided into 2 parts, and so it's not an insect. Now, insects also have something that spiders don't have, some people would say thankfully spiders don't have, which is wings. Insects can fly. And if you think of your typical insect, like a honeybee or a butterfly, you'll think they've got 4 wings. Beetles look like they have only 2 wings, because the front pair of wings are making a hard shell that protects the body and protects the other wings. So if you've ever had a ladybird, which is a beetle, ladybird walks up to the top of your finger and it looks like a little tank. And then when it gets to the top of your finger, it'll open up its shell and it'll get the little wings out from underneath and fly away. And so one of the reasons we think that beetles are so successful is that they've got the best of both worlds. If they want to be protected, they can be protected. If they want to be mobile, they can be mobile. So if you're a snail, you're protected, but you can't move very easily. If you're a butterfly, you can move around easily, but you're very vulnerable and you can't be squashed and you can't dig in the ground. So beetles have really got the best of both worlds, and that might be why there's so many.
Well, that's one of the things they've done so incredibly well. As you said, we find them pretty much all over the place. What is it that makes them so successful? Apart from being sort of mobile, are there any other things that have made them this incredibly successful group of animals?
Well, I think having the best of both worlds is important, but also they were in the right place at the right time. Because at the end of the Cretaceous period, there was a big disaster that killed all the dinosaurs and the ammonites and lots of other animal life. And it changed the face of life on Earth. And at that time, lots of different kinds of plants disappeared and other kinds of plants became dominant. And the ancestors of the beetles were on the ancestors of the flowering plants. And as flowering plants took over the world, the beetles took over along with them.
Fantastic.
So there's a beetle for everything. Even you have a collection like this, we have beetles that eat the collection.
Which is, in itself is a bit of a problem, really.
You know, with 400,000 different types, you have to divide the world into 400,000 different jobs. And so some of them will be eating flowers, some of them will be pollinating flowers, some of them, like ladybirds, will be eating green fly, some of them will be eating things like dung and carrion and dead wood, and some of them are eating dead insects. And so when you've got 22 million dead insects all together in one place,
it's a bit of a feast.
yes, exactly.
Well, we'll talk about some of those little jobs in a second. You actually mentioned about sort of flying beetles, and some of you here may have actually seen a flying beetle today, because over in the Hinty Hall we have our entomology display, and we've actually got a few beetles in flight in the entomology display pinned up here. But these are quite famous, these beetles, aren't they? What beetles are we looking at
Well,
here?
yes, would anybody like to guess what kind of beetles these are? Yes? Nope. Another guess, anybody?
Any other guess?
Was there a scarabs I heard there? That's what they are. They're scarab dung beetles. Sorry, you had...
Emerald beetle.
Ah, yes, some of them are emerald scarabs. That's right. And this is also a scarab. And you might know that the scarabs were sacred to the ancient Egyptians. One of the early insects that was elevated to the status of a god. Because the scarab collects a ball of dung, and you all know what dung is, do you? Dung is animal poo. It collects a ball of dung, and it rolls it across the desert. And the Egyptians looked at these beetles rolling this ball, and they looked up at the sun in the sky. And they thought there must be a really big beetle rolling that across the sky. So the scarab became the sun god. And what they're actually doing, though, is they're collecting a ball of dung and they're rolling it away from the main pile of dung, because beetles have got a really sensitive sense of smell. And if you're an animal and you put a pile of dung down in the desert, the beetles will smell it from a long distance away and they'll come flying in. And it's a bit like if somebody was to drop a huge great pile of money in the middle of the high street. Everybody would just take as much money as they can and take it back off somewhere where the others couldn't get it from them. And this is what the dung beetles are doing. They're collecting the dung into a big ball and rolling it away. Then when they've got it somewhere safe, where there are no other dung beetles apart from the male and female who are working together, they'll bury it in the ground and they'll lay just one egg in this ball of dung. and then they'll go straight back to the dung pile and try and get another one. So what they're doing is cleaning up the dung, and they're doing it really, really quickly because they're competing with each other. And you can imagine what the world would look like if we didn't have any dung beetles, can't you? Because if there weren't dung beetles doing this, there'd be dung everywhere. And we don't actually have to imagine this, because when European people first went to Australia, they thought, yeah, we'd like to have a barbecue, we'd like to have some woolly jumpers, we're going to bring cows, and we're going to bring sheep. And if anybody said, why don't you bring some dung beetles, they'd just say, well, we don't need dung beetles, do we? We just want cows and sheep. So they brought all the cows and sheep, and there was nothing cleaning up the dung, because the local dung beetle, I don't know if you've ever seen wombat poo. Wombat poo is square, it looks like little dice. And the local dung beetles who are collecting wombat poo, they look at this thing that's been dropped by a cow or a sheep, and they think, oh, I don't know what that is. Don't want to eat this fancy foreign food. And go back and eat the wombat poo. So eventually the Australian government had to bring dung beetles like these from Africa and from Europe, which is where cows and sheep originated, from those two continents. And within 3 years, this problem caused by disease and dung was solved by the introduction of dung beetles.
So they're pretty hard workers, the dung beetles, cleaning up after other animals. You mentioned there's a few others that clean up, and including beetles that eat dead animals.
Yes.
And we actually use them here at the museum, don't we?
Well, yes, in the fish section in particular, but also in the bird section. They might want to have, if you looked in the public galleries, you'll see these beautiful skeletons of birds and fish and things. And all the little ribs and the little bones. And you think, how's somebody cleaned all the meat off that? It's actually quite difficult. And one of the best ways of doing it is you just put your dead animal into a big tank full of flesh-eating beetles and close it all up. And the beetles will go to work and they'll eat all the flesh and they'll leave the bones. So you put it in a tray, and then you come back 3 months later, and there's just a tray full of bones. So that's a good way of cleaning up bones.
Working pretty hard.
Have you actually done this?
I've never actually done it. I have been in the room that they do it in, and let me tell you, I never really want to go back in that room ever again, because it's quite a smell that you get there. But what I do quite like about that room is that if they don't have animals to feed them, we don't always have things we want to reduce down. They feed them things like sausages or sometimes marmites, because they really like marmites.
So you need to keep them alive.
Yeah, you've got to keep them going.
I've seen them sort of slinging some dead squirrel off the road in there, just to keep the beetles ticking over until next time they want to put something in.
Amazing. So we've been talking about some of the jobs and saying how many different types of beetles there are. I think a really good question to ask, what is the biggest type of beetle that we actually find?
Yes, well, luckily, Eddie, we've got it here. This is the biggest beetle in the world. I'll just put it down there so that you can get it up on the screen.
Hopefully, yeah, we can bring it up on the camera and be able to see it a bit closer.
But the biggest beetle in the world has got the Latin name of Titanus giganteus. And it lives in the tropical forests of northern Brazil and the Guianas in South America. It lives in really damp tropical forests where there are really big trees. And we've never seen the larva, the grub of this beetle. Probably because it's deep in the ground, living in the roots of big old mahogany trees. And it probably looks like a baby's leg. It's probably a great big worm. Enormous big worm, because the larvae of insects are usually much bigger than the adults.
So they look quite big and quite threatening, these ones, but what sort of things would they be feeding on?
But they're completely harmless, and the larvae are probably feeding on the roots of really big old dead trees. But the adults maybe don't even eat at all. The big jaws that they have are for making a wound that they can, in wood, that they can lay the eggs inside. And this big thing that looks like a sting at the back end of one of them is actually an egg-laying tube. And the way to collect these, and David Attenborough does this in Life in the Undergrowth, the way to collect these is to put a bright light out into the tropical forest, and the insects fly towards the bright light. And every so often, you'll put your sheet up, and you put bright light on it. Every so often, this great big thing the size of a pigeon will come in. But more normally, there'll be just thousands and thousands of very small moths and beetles. But before the invention of electric light, they were very, very difficult to collect. And does anybody want to guess how you might collect these beetles at night if you haven't invented electric light?
It's a bit of
Fire?
a tricky one.
Fire is quite good, but if you have a fire and the beetle flies in towards the fire, you're not going to get a very good specimen. That's the problem with that. They did use oil lamps. Again, oil lamp is not as bright as a nice electric bulb there. One of the tricks that they learnt eventually is that if you go on a moonlit night, they will fly towards the reflection of the moon in the water and then drown in the water, and you'll see these insects struggling in the water in the moonlight. But there was somebody who had an even better idea, which was to make friends with a tribe of people who are living alongside one of the Amazon tributaries and eating a lot of fish. And when you're cleaning your fish for the table, you find inside its stomach, it's been eating drowned Titanus beetles. And you can buy them from the locals. So it's like having a Kinder egg. You open up your fish and you have something inside that you can sell.
That's the worst Kinder surprise ever. So they're pretty amazing. You mentioned something quite interesting there. They've got that big egg-laying tube at the end of their body that looks a bit like a sting. Do any beetles have bites or sting or venom? Are they dangerous in that sort of way?
There's only one beetle that's got venom, and it's quite rare, and it's one of this family. It's a South American longhorn beetle. It's called a scorpion beetle. And its antennae have got a poisonous sting on the end. So if you're a monkey and you grab this beetle, it'll sting you on the back of your hand. And it's not a very bad sting, but it's just amazing that they've evolved this sting, which is like that of a scorpion, but of course they're completely not related to a scorpion. But it's a very rare beetle.
So really, we shouldn't really be afraid of any kinds of beetles that
No,
are
beetles
harmless.
don't deliberately seek to bite you, they don't sting you, they don't usually have venom.
Fantastic. Well, before we move on, talk about some different types of beetles. Does anybody have any questions for Max at this time about any beetle-related things? We'll ask for some questions at the end, and you can come down at the end and chat to us a little bit more. Max, let's talk about some more of the beetles we've got here, because we've got a wonderful tribe, some quite colourful beetles here. Can we talk a little bit about these ones?
Ah, yes. These are what we, in scientific circles, like to call bling beetles. They are the gold and silver chafers from Central America. They live in Panama and Costa Rica and countries like that. And they live in the cloud forest. Now, has anybody ever been in a cloud forest? No. Well, it's called a cloud forest for a good reason, because it's high altitude tropical forest. And it sticks up into the clouds. And, of course, the clouds are full of rain. And these are some of the wettest places in the world. I've worked in a cloud forest, and it stops raining for about 40 minutes in the afternoon if you're lucky. It just rains continuously. And you've got these giant trees with these giant leaves, and in every single one of these leaves there's a droplet of water. So the monkeys and the birds and the other predators are just used to seeing these droplets, and they ignore anything which is globular and shining. So these beetles are disguising themselves as water droplets.
It's a pretty clever little disguise, but what I've always found really amazing is that there's actually quite a lot that we can learn from looking at these shiny beetles, isn't there?
Well, there's a lot we can learn from all kinds of beetles, but if you were to paint this beetle with the kind of paint that we use for a sports car or even a space satellite, it would be much heavier than it actually is. So they can make this reflective coating better than we can. If we can imitate how they can make it, we can make more efficient coatings. And we've been copying various tricks from beetles quite often. The dung beetle, for example, I was saying that it can smell a pile of cow poo about 2 miles away, because it's got these structures on its antennae that can detect tiny, tiny quantities of a chemical in the atmosphere. And if we could find out how they're doing that, we could copy that as well. We could detect explosives or detect poisonous gases or whatever it is that we wanted to detect at very, very, very low quantities.
So again, that's kind of another reason why it's so important for us to have these collections, because we can do this research and use it to hopefully inspire us to discover.
Oh yes, we have about 300 or 400 people coming to work on the collections every year from all over the world. And they're all answering different questions. Lots of them are doing taxonomy, which is the science of classification and the study of the natural world. But others are doing something else, like looking at the structures of the insects or looking at the biology of them, conservation of them, all kinds of things.
It's a really amazing range of stuff. Talking about all these collections, let's talk a little bit about how we actually collect them, because you mentioned before we've been collecting these for sort of hundreds of years to get these here. Are we still collecting beetles today?
Yes, we do. I mean, I've had colleagues who are out in tropical Africa. Like, for example, this box is recently collected, and we've only just finished identifying everything in here. And there's nothing that's new, but that's partly because they're all quite large beetles. But when you get out into the tropical forests, you're quite likely to find things that are new, things that have never been seen before. There are still species to be discovered.
And that's a good question, Max. Have you ever discovered anything new yourself?
I have discovered a few new species of beetle, yes.
And when you discover a new species of beetle, what's the process for kind of like discovering it and giving it that name?
Well, yes, when you discover something, the first thing you want to do is you want to find out what group it belongs to, i.e. what genus it is in. So when you have a scientific name, like the scientific name of our species is Homo sapiens. And that means that we're the species sapiens in the genus Homo. And there are other members of the genus Homo, but they're all extinct, like Neanderthal man and Homo habilis, Homo neanderthalensis. And that means that they're closely related to us because they're in the same genus, but they're not quite the same species. And with beetles, of course, a genus might have, in some cases, up to 2,000 or 3,000 species in it. So it's not just like genus Homo, where there's only one living species and a few extinct ones, but there might be hundreds of species, or even, in some cases, thousands of species. So if you know what genus it belongs to, these belong to the genus Chrysina on the screen here. And they're two different species. You can see very clearly that they're not the same. One of them's silver, one of them's gold, they're a different shape, they live in a different place. So once you know what genus it is, you want to eliminate all the other species that are already known to occur in that genus. And if you eliminate them all, it's a process of elimination, then you know that you've got something new. Assuming that you've got the genus right in the first place. Yes. So it's quite a difficult process, and it involves going to collections and looking at specimens and comparing it up and eliminating them.
So I imagine it can take quite a long time sometimes if there's...
Well, sometimes, yes, but you gradually acquire an expertise. And you know, it's a little bit like recognition of faces. If you go to a new school, everybody's unfamiliar, but after you've been there for a couple of years, you recognize everybody, and even if you just see them at the bus stop, you think, oh yeah, that's Lucy from my class, or that's Fred. Whereas when you first come, everybody looks the same, and it's confusing, like everything. It's exactly like that. You start to recognize the ones.
It just takes years to be able to do it with thousands and thousands of beetles.
Yeah, it's like being in a really big school.
So when you're collecting them, you mentioned about your colleagues sort of travelling around, and I know that you've done some travelling as well, because we've got this quite wonderful picture of you here. Where was this one taken?
I guess that's posed, I think. That's on a fallen tree in Peru, in the Madre de Dios forest. And that tree has been killed by a strangling fig. So you get a big tree growing up towards the light, and it will grow as fast as it can to get up into the rainforest canopy. And the strangling fig is a parasitic plant that goes up the tree and tries to get up into the canopy using another tree as a support. But unfortunately, if the fig grows too quickly, it can pull down the tree that it's on, which ends up killing the strangling fig as well. And that's what's happened here. So the white thing that I've got my foot on is the strangling fig, and the big trunk lying across is the tree that it has killed, killing itself in the process. And when that happens, the sunlight comes through to the rainforest floor, and all the seeds that are in the ground suddenly think, well, we'll get a chance to get up into the canopy, and they all start growing. So you get all these young trees, they just come up like mushrooms in just a matter of weeks. And all of the insects and other animals will come to these clearings and feed on the leaves and the flowers and enjoy the sunlight, because the rainforest is mostly dark. And you get these little sunlit patches, and that's where everything is happening. So if you want to see animals, even if you want to see big animals like jaguars or tapirs, you want to come to these clearings and just wait in the clearings early in the morning, and you'll see the big birds and the big mammals.
So you're collecting lots of different animals, as you say, finding there. One of my favourite things, when you're collecting, you actually have a little bit of competition, don't you, with some of the things you're collecting? Not specifically from other scientists, but our friend that I hunted there.
Yes, there's a little bit of the local wildlife there. The green one, of course, is the emerald tree boa, which is a rare snake. And we were out late at night, we were there at about 2 in the morning, and there were these kind of jumping rats everywhere. And wherever we went in the forest, we were seeing these little jumping rats running around. And then we saw this snake was just sitting there, waiting for one of the jumping rats to go directly underneath it. And eventually, we went out and we saw it there, and it was waiting patiently. And when we came back, it had already got one. So one of these rats had just walked into the wrong place, and the snake would have taken it. The other thing is the cane toad. There is a species of South American toad that they introduced into Australia to control pests, and that was a real mistake because it's a voracious, hungry animal. It's also poisonous. So it's eating everything, and if something else tries to eat it, it'll often get sick. In the case of some of the Australian marsupial cats and so on, it will sometimes die. So the cane toad is quite an obnoxious animal. And we were running a light trap in the jungle where we put a sheet up and you put a light on the sheet and thousands of insects fly into the sheet. And the cane toads were coming in and eating all the insects, and they were much better at collecting the insects than we were. So there'd be a load of insects and this cane toad would go whoop, 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 whoop. And so I'd pick them up and sort of walk off into the forest and dump them and say, look, can you stay there? And 10 minutes later they'd be back again. Whoop, whoop, whoop. So yes, you have to compete with the local fauna sometimes.
It can be a little bit of a challenge. So you mentioned some of the ways that you use to collect them there. We've got a few different techniques now. You mentioned the light trap. Let's be just shining a light.
Yes, there's the light trap at the back there. I mean, the difficult thing with a light trap is that you have to get a generator and a supply of petrol into the jungle, which is really quite hard work. And I was always the youngest, so I was always the one who was carrying the generator. And yeah, that was quite exhausting.
But then we've got a few other techniques, the ones that you see here. So there's this one at the top left. That seems to be a bottle with a hole cut in it.
Yes, it's a bottle with a hole cut in it. And what is there is we found a dead mouse by the side of the road. So we hung the dead mouse in a bit of netting and stuck it in the bottle and hauled it up into the canopy of the tree. So an insect that was looking for a bird's nest with a dead bird in it or something like that might be attracted to this and be collected. And that might be the only way that you can collect an insect that wants to go in a dead bird in a dead bird's nest, because it's not a very common habitat. It was actually quite effective. And the other two traps are for flying insects. So the insect's flying along and it hits the black netting and it drops down into a tray, and then you can go and examine what you've collected in the tray afterwards.
Now what's quite cool about some of these things, like, as you say, the light traps, and things like pitfall traps as well, they're things that people can quite easily make at home in their own gardens, aren't they?
Oh yes, if you put some pitfall traps or even the light, if you've ever left the window open and the light on and gone out on a warm summer's evening and you come home and your house is full of moths, that's how the light trap works.
Fantastic. Okay, well, we are coming up to the end of the time we have today. Max, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. If you'd like to come down and take a closer look, we've got loads of specimens here to have a look at, and Max will happily take some questions from you as well. For now, just like to say thank you very much, everybody, for coming along to Nature Live today. Please enjoy the rest of your day.
Do come have a look. We've got original Darwin material here.